Once hailed as a hero, the moral CEO, Dan Price, now facing allegations of sexual abuse, including rape, forced to step down as the head of Gravity Payment, saying that his presence has become a distraction. In 2015, Price made national headlines when he cut his salary by $1 million to raise his workers' minimum salary to $70,000.
I realized if I'm paying people less than that, I'm actually unintentionally taking away a certain amount of happiness and emotional health from them.
But Price now resigning, his decision coming on the heels of an explosive New York Times article detailing alleged sexual misconduct. The paper reporting it spoke to a number of women who described predatory encounters with Price, his alleged victims speaking out.
There was a pattern of him reaching out to women who were supporters and then went on to hurt them in various emotional and physical ways.
At that moment, I saw his eyes and just his whole expression just completely change. And it just really, really terrified me.
He's pleaded not guilty to those charges. Meanwhile, Price's ex-wife is also speaking out. Christy Colon was married to Price for nearly 7 years. The couple divorced in 2012. She says he was both physically and emotionally abusive. According to Colon, Price presented a different version of himself when others were around.
It was always extremely less stressful for me if other people were there, because I knew he wouldn't be as brutal as he was to me in private.
She says that she has been in touch with several of Price's alleged victims and understands why some were reluctant to speak out earlier.
I think people were terrified of what Dan would potentially do.
Hello, thanks for clicking on this video from Checkmate Humanity. Okay, I know that a lot of you are waiting for part 2 of my Watts family tragedy series. It's actually becoming 3, maybe even more parts, and I'm working on it. It's coming soon. But I just came across this very important, very late-breaking story from just the other day that has now made national media attention. It's all over the place in mainstream media. And it's about a CEO of Gravity Payments named Dan Price. He became famous for giving all of his employees at his company a minimum $70,000 pay, and became famous for that not only in mainstream media, but on social media, but particularly social media. He used this idea of pay equality and things like that to make connections and boost his image, and he even became politically active and actively campaigned for Andrew Yang during the 2020 election. So I really want to bring this to you because it has such important and deep implications for social media and how we need to watch out for ourselves on social media when there are people like this person is alleged to be on social media. I'm also watching the Parkland shooter sentencing trial, and I plan to cover some aspects of that because I'm absolutely gobsmacked at what I'm learning about the shooter's life, and I want to bring attention to the kind of upbringing that could potentially lead to a kid like Nicholas Cruz. Okay, but let's get back into this story. I'm going to read this full article to you from the New York Times, and as I read it, I'm going to add some commentary, but I'm going to do more opinion and commentary after I read the article at the end. Now, I have a personal experience with the subject of the article and had full knowledge of the accusations against him in the workplace, but no idea about allegations that resulted from his social media connection. So I was actually fairly shocked when I saw this news. Now, during my commentary, I'm not going to be disclosing anything that's not already public knowledge in some way, shape, or form, regardless of whether it made mainstream news. I'm not talking about anything that I know personally about this person or this company. And before I start reading the article, I just want to give some of you a warning that at least about the last third to 2/3 of the article are very difficult to hear. They include allegations of a shocking nature. So, you know, you might want to skip that and go to the end if you really don't want to hear about that. This article is behind a paywall, so I'm bringing it to you on my dime. It's not a dime, though, let me tell you that. And while I read through the article, I will also be displaying images and, you know, relevant images and other things that relate to the story and this individual. Here's the article from the New York Times. Some poll quotes. Lifting someone out of poverty is the most effective antidepressant in the world. Dan Price, Seattle. That's his Twitter handle. I believe it's his Instagram handle as well. Social allows him to control the narrative, a former employee. In the unlikely event that you are falsely accused, remember that it will be much easier for you to overcome false allegations when it will be for actual victims to overcome the trauma of harassment or assault. Dan Price, posting on LinkedIn. Remember that. This article was written on August 18th, just a few days ago, and I just saw it for the first time yesterday, and I was kind of thunderstruck. So I'm going to read through it now. Social media was a CEO's bullhorn and how he lured women. Dan Price was applauded for paying a minimum salary of $70,000 at his Seattle company and criticizing corporate greed. The adulation helped to tide and enable his behavior. Seattle. Casey Margis, a model and artist, first learned about Dan Price in 2020, the way many people do, through social media posts that celebrated his progressive politics. 5 years earlier, Mr. Price had propelled himself to an unlikely position as the head of a 110-person payment processing company when he told his employees that he was raising their minimum pay to $70,000. His announcement was covered by the New York Times and NBC News. Esquire did a photo shoot. He made appearances on The Daily Show and at the Aspen Ideas Festival. By the time Ms. Margis discovered him, his self-styled role as a CEO speaking truth about corporate greed resonated with a wide audience. His posts on social media had been liked tens of millions of times. He joked with Kelly Clarkson on her daytime talk show with Lionel Richie looking on. He introduced Andrew Yang to a Seattle crowd during Mr. Yang's presidential campaign. He video chatted with former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich, who called him the moral CEO in America. Mr. Price was a young, handsome executive whose worldview spoke to her. A real-life influencer on social media who criticized the excesses and arrogance of other business leaders. He posted a seemingly endless stream on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn saying the right things about inequality, about mental health, about women. After Mrs. Margis liked one of his Instagram posts in 2020, Mr. Price, who was 35, messenger, "Happy Valentine's Day, beautiful." Ms. Margis, who was 27, ignored the message initially but replied back early last year after friends in a group chat once again shared one of his tweets. And this is Casey Margis. Soon they were talking regularly. Mr. Price visited her near San Diego and flew her to Seattle. But what started as a whirlwind courtship ended 3 months later with an accusation of I can't say the full word on YouTube. On Monday, the police in Palm Springs, California, said they had referred Mrs. Margis's case to local prosecutors, recommending a charge of of a drugged victim. Prosecutors in Seattle earlier this year charged Mr. Price with assault in another incident. After responding to questions earlier in the day from the New York Times, Mr. Price tweeted that he had resigned on Wednesday evening as chief executive of his company, Gravity Payments. He wrote that he had become a distraction and needed to focus time on fighting false allegations made against me. There were warning signs about Mr. Price, but Ms. Margis didn't see them. When she did a Google search, many of the top results, and this is really important. I love how this article, this is me talking now, I really appreciate how this article interweaves the social media action with the real life action, because we're starting to see more and more that social media and real life are starting to kind of collide with each other, because in most cases people aren't who they say on social media, especially if they're a predator. If a predator is on social media praying that he or she is going to be a much, much different person on social media than they are in real life, when it's a lot easier to tell that they're a predator. So I'm continuing on. When she did a Google search, many of the top results for Dan Price were his own social media accounts, along with flattering stories. Buried was the reason he had, for a time several years ago, nearly vanished from public attention. An article I wrote, and this is the author of this story, back in 2015 for Bloomberg Businessweek, revealed that his story about the pay raise had notable holes, and that his former wife had accused him of DV. Overnight, the attention largely dried up, but Mr. Price found an antidote to obscurity: social media. A lot of people, this is me talking, a lot of people find an antidote to obscurity, and that is social media, again, where they can pretend to be a completely different person than they really are. They can be a completely different person than the person they've escaped from being in real life. Continuing on. Tweet by tweet, his online persona grew back. The bad news faded into the background. It was the opposite of being canceled. Just as social media can ruin someone, so too can it, through time, persistence, and audacity, bury a troubled past. Mr. Price's internet fame had enabled a pattern of, in his personal life, and hostile behavior at his company. Interviews with more than 50 people, documents, and police reports show. He has used his celebrity to pursue women online who say he hurt them, both physically and emotionally. Ms. Margus is one of more than a dozen women who spoke with the New York Times about predatory encounters with Mr. Price. Here's a tweet from Dan Price. A male president was so angry he lost that he incited a mob against the U.S. Capitol. I never want to hear again that women would be too emotional to be president. Yep, that's a very typical tweet from Dan Price. Quote, social allows him to control the narrative, said Ryan Pickle, who spent almost 7 years running marketing for Mr. Price's company. In his statement to the Times, Mr. Price said that he had never physically or sexually anyone, and that the other accusations of inappropriate behavior towards women in this story are simply false. Mr. Price added that descriptions of him as a toxic boss were inaccurate. Quote, making Gravity an outstanding place to work is my top priority, he said, and I believe I'm achieving that goal. Quote, is this the best boss in America? That was the title of a cover story about Dan Price in 2015 that was plastered all over the interior walls of Gravity Payments. I first met Mr. Price in the fall of 2015, after he and his wage-raising story were seemingly everywhere. Though his business was obscure, Gravity made a few $1 million a year in profits, processing credit card payments, job applications, and customers flooded in. Mr. Price was a charismatic messenger in a moment of growing inequality, but the story he was telling in public didn't add up. Mr. Price told the media that his brother, who co-owned Gravity, sued him after the wage increase and implied it was retribution for reducing their profits. Court documents show that Mr. Price's splashy $70,000 wage announcement took place after the lawsuit was initiated. And this is a picture of Christy Colon, Dan Price's ex-wife. Mr. Price told media outlets that his divorce several years earlier was amicable, but his former wife, Christy Colon, had given a TEDx talk in October 2015 in which she described their relationship as abuse. This is me talking when I had a very brief interaction and encounter with Dan Price and Gravity Payments. This was a known allegation that he was already fighting and had been fighting and was using his social media presence to, I don't know, he was coming back using his social media presence. He got mad at me for ignoring him and grabbed me and shook me again, Ms. Cologne read from her old journal. He started punching me in the stomach and slapped me across the face. She recalled once locking herself in a car, afraid he was going to body slam me into the ground again or waterboard me in our upstairs bathroom like he had done before. Mr. Price said these incidents never happened. The video was never made public. Mr. Perkle said that Mr. Price's direction, he contacted the University of Kentucky, which hosted the TEDx talk, saying the presentation could be defamatory. The university said it simply decided not to post it. Mr. Price denied that he directed Mr. Pickle to contact the university. Mr. Perkle, I'm sorry, I said Pickle earlier, I meant Perkle. Sorry, Mr. Perkle, said he deeply regretted his role in preventing the video from becoming public. I sure hope so. That was me talking, in case you didn't know. When the Bloomberg Businessweek article ran in December 2015, the reaction was swift. Mr. Price lost a $500,000 book contract and the Hollywood talent agency WME dropped him. Just as fast as he had risen, he was gone. Shortly after the article published, Mr. Price pulled his staff into a conference room and told them that he had protected Miss Cologne. He said she was young and emotional. Quote, there was a period of time where she just had a lot of trouble and she was acting crazy. He said, according to an audio recording of the meeting. I would restrain her, which is not right. He had his staff compile a long dossier on perceived threats, including his former wife, brother, and me, the author, according to Mr. Perkle and 3 others. Mr. Price said the dossier was not his idea. He ultimately won the court fight with his brother, and judge found that he did not pay himself more than their shareholder contracts allowed. Mr. Price briefly returned to the spotlight in 2016 when his employees appeared to surprise him with a royal blue Tesla. He teared up and said, "Are you kidding me?" And here's a tweet of him with his new Tesla. 5 years ago today, our employees bought me a Tesla to thank me for cutting my CEO pay 94% to pay them at least $70K. Since then, I paid them back with raises close to $100K, and they paid me back again by growing the company. Take care of employees, and they will take care of you. Great message, right? Yeah. Quote, "That was his idea completely," said Mr. Perkle, and confirmed by Matt Doe, who worked in the marketing department for 4 years. Mr. Price said that was not true, and the idea that some people are trying to soil this cherished memory is deeply hurtful. But Alyssa O'Neill, the then 21-year-old employee who people thought had suggested the Tesla gift at the time, said in an interview that one of Mr. Price's senior lieutenants actually made the suggestion in a small meeting and told her to take credit. The stunt got attention from mainstream press, but it quickly faded. Mr. Price later that year summoned a handful of employees to his home so they could watch a documentary about the attempted comeback of Anthony Weiner, the New York politician caught messaging sexually explicit photos to young female supporters. Mr. Price reclined in bed, healing from knee surgery, as his staff sat on the bedroom floor, according to several people present. He asked what they learned about drowning out negative news. Quote, "He is definitely obsessed with how seemingly you can just become famous," said Mr. Doe, who was there. Mr. Price turns to social media where he could control his message. With each post about out-of-control CEO pay and stagnant wages, his following grew. By 2019, America's Best Boss was on his way back. The Wall Street Journal included him in a group of luminaries, and Nick Kristof profiled him in the New York Times opinion section. So this is the New York Times now doing a different, very different type of story. Mr. Price didn't write most of the posts himself. He hired a ghostwriter, Mike Rosenberg, a former reporter who resigned from the Seattle Times after sending sexually explicit messages to a female reporter in Brooklyn. So this is me talking here, okay? What I've noticed in this article and in patterns of behavior with other people that are like this guy is alleged to be, what I've noticed is that they tend to take up for people that they identify with. They tend to take up for people that maybe have been falsely accused or something. So you see here that this ghostwriter for all of Mr. Price's social media had been fired from the Seattle Times after sending messages, and this is proven, and he apologized for it, sending sexually explicit messages to a female reporter in Brooklyn. Well, Dan felt bad for him, in my opinion. Dan Price felt bad for him, thought he was talented, and decided to hire him for gravity payments. And think about the Anthony Weiner documentary story. Once again, a comeback from a situation that involves sexually explicit images or something that could really tamper a person's public image. And he has them all sit around and watch it and then ask them, how do you think you could drown out negative views? And in all honesty, the whole point of this story is that social media was able to help him drown out that negative news. Social media helped present this airbrushed, may possibly incredibly devious picture of this person that he was able to use to his advantage. So I'm going to continue on. Quote, "We had employees that were livid about his hiring," said Bobby Powers, Gravity's former head of human resources. Mr. Rosenberg declined to comment. That was probably smart. Mr. Price said he used social media to help Gravity attract customers and employees, saying that, quote, "I get over 100 direct messages daily," and that he shared the company's story to inspire others. In a morning show spot in 2021 revisiting the wage increase, Mr. Price told CBS that he was, quote, "way happier now," unquote. At Gravity, the CBS correspondent added, "It seems like There's a lot of that going around. Wow, I'll work for you, Kelly Clarkson, December 2019.
Wow, I'll work for you.
Dan Price, the good boss, went viral, but more than 24 former employees say that the image fueling his clout and that attracted his female followers was a mirage. This is where we're going to start to get into the worst parts of the triggering moments of this case. Quote, "You never knew which Dan you were going to get," said Stefan Bennett, who worked at Gravity for almost 13 years. He and others said Mr. Price was an unpredictable leader. Small incidents made him snap. I'm going to stop here and ask you, as I start to describe these behaviors that the employees and the former employees are talking about, recognize how that then translates into his personal life behavior, especially when it comes to women. Jen Peck, who held a top role at Gravity, found it so troubling, her doctor eventually wrote a note to Gravity recommending she quit for her own physical and mental well-being, calling the environment hostile. Ms. Peck is now director of engineering at the real estate site Redfin. But Mr. Price's profile made leaving the company difficult. Corinne Ward, who spent almost 5 years in leadership, quote, "It felt like a part of you was giving up on this thing you had been promoting." So this is a screenshot, and this is a image that Dan Price also uses on his Twitter. Is this it? Yes, there's his Twitter. So you see, there's his Twitter, and there's the YouTube image from the Kelly Clarkson show. I was working with this company when this happened. I made the arrangements for him to go onto the Kelly Clarkson show and worked with all their producers on that. So I just want to be in full disclosure about my role in this. Before he announced his resignation, Mr. Price suggested 9 Gravity employees I should speak with. Most said they didn't know him well, enjoyed their work at the company, and described him as a boss who had taken feedback that he could be too forceful. Quote, "Lifting someone out of poverty is the most effective antidepressant in the world," unquote, liked 185,000 times. That is, that's a very nice thing to say. It's unclear whether he wrote that or if Mike Rosenberg, his ghostwriter, wrote it. I don't know. In April 2021, 3 months into their relationship, Mrs. Margus met Mr. Price in Palm Springs. Along with the calming rush of Talkwitz Creek, Mr. Price hiked barefoot, often whipping out his phone to check his Twitter. His message celebrating the 6th anniversary of the wage increase got liked 180,000 times, and other media, including Peace and People, shared his story. The next morning, Mr. Price had to make a call and demanded that Ms. Margus leave their room, she said. Wearing just a bikini and cover-up, she protested, but he insisted. For hours, she was locked out, killing time by messaging friends. "Drop him," one friend wrote back. "It's a no for me, dog," another agreed. Mr. Price found her by the pool and leaned in for a kiss, she recalled. She rebuffed him. He snapped that she was not a good listener and didn't understand him. He said it is hard being him in the world because of his intelligence, she later recalled. This account of what happened next was detailed in interviews with Ms. Margus, a police report, contemporaneous messages with friends, and interviews with 3 people she spoke with soon after. So this is me talking. That's the New York Times telling you. This is corroborated among many, many sources, and we've seen documentation as well. Ms. Margus returned to room 423, where she took a cannabis edible to counter insomnia, something she's regularly done since being at the 2017 mass shooting at a Las Vegas music festival. Oh my God, how horrible. I'm so sorry this woman has had to go through these things. Mr. Price returned and tried to initiate sex. Quote, "No, I just took an edible and I'm going to bed," she would tell the police, she said. "We'll talk about this in the morning." As she drifted to sleep, she felt him penetrate her. She told the police. She pretended to be asleep, worried he would kill her if she tried to stop him. After he finished, she waited a few minutes, then walked to the bathroom before confronting him. "Did you just rape me?" she told the police, she said. He flatly denied it, she said. She was shaking so badly and could hardly speak. She would text a friend later, a few hours, adding that he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "What I know happened didn't happen." This is me talking. That's the definition of gaslighting. She told Mr. Price she felt pain and had semen inside of her. He began offering excuses that he was just using his fingers. Then he said just the tip of his penis. "I know what you did," she responded. According to the police report, Mr. Price boasted that no one had believed Ms. Cologne's allegations of abuse because of who he is, and that no one would believe her either. Mr. Price retreated to the front desk, demanded a new room, and provided what the manager told the police amounted to a backstory, that his girlfriend felt uncomfortable about falling asleep during sex, the manager recalled, so he opted to leave her alone in the hotel room. This is just a side note for me. Why would you give that much information to the front desk guy? Why? I that just doesn't come up in casual conversation with the front desk guy. Continuing. Once the cannabis wore off, Ms. Margus fled home. The next morning, her instinct was to fight. What the New York Times just described there without saying it was trauma. First it was freeze, then it was flight, then it was fight. The response to trauma, especially when it gets triggered over and over and over again, can be one or all of those responses. Freeze, fight, or flight. She texted her friends that she might need them as witnesses. She saved her underwear and filed the police report. Then she called her mother, who waited in the hospital parking lot while Ms. Margus submitted to a ARC hit. Ms. Margus returned to the car and gave her mother one of the small comfort gifts the hospital gives survivors, a heart-shaped stone with one word etched: hope. Quote, "Always invest in people." Liked 179,000 times. 2 days later, Ms. Cologne, Mr. Price's former wife, was checking Instagram when she got a message. "I'm reaching out and hope this is not triggering in any way," Ms. Margus wrote. Ms. Margus went on to say that Mr. Price had art her and that she believed Ms. Cologne's every allegation. It wasn't the first time that Ms. Cologne had heard from women about bad encounters with Mr. Price. Ms. Cologne had relocated across the country and tried to move on, but escaping Mr. Price's presence was impossible. Even her own therapist had told her she had seen friends share his posts on LinkedIn. Ms. Margus said she had considered telling her story publicly. "I want to do all I can to make sure he never harms another woman again in his life," she wrote, but feared he would come after me. Eventually, Ms. Cologne connected Ms. Margus to a man named Doug Forbes, who had been blogging about Mr. Price for years. True. Mr. Forbes had wanted to make an uplifting documentary about Mr. Price, but fixated instead on what he alleged to be fraud. Gravity defended its practices in a Facebook post. Mr. Forbes published posts often running thousands of words long about Mr. Price, and had tried without success to get more than 30 news organizations, including the Times, to run them. But if someone Googled the right terms, his blog would show up. He heard from Ms. Margus and posted an anonymized version of her account last August. Here he is on CBS Mornings last year. Mr. Price said on Wednesday that he believed Mr. Forbes was funded by a competitor whom he declined to name. Mr. Forbes called the claim irrefutably false. Other women found the post based on Ms. Margus's experience and contacted Mr. Forbes, who published additional anonymous accounts and introduced several women to each other. That informal community of women that Mr. Forbes helped forge also contacted me, the writer of the story. But there were even more women. In all, more than a dozen described predatory behavior. Mr. Price messaged Serena Jowers, a fitness coach near Seattle, in December 2020, after she liked some of his posts on Instagram. On their third date, Ms. Jowers said he pulled up videos on Pornhub to show her what he liked. After she resisted watching the porn, he pressured her into having sex, she said. She realized he was touching her with only one hand, then saw him holding his phone. He was recording them. Ms. Jowers jumped up and grabbed the nearest blanket, yelled at him, and fled, she said. The next morning, she texted him saying the filming made her feel like she was not in control of her own body. Quote, "I want you to delete any videos, pics you took," she wrote. "I'll do that," he immediately texted back. The 3 other women, 2 of whom he also first messaged on social media, also told me that they learned Mr. Price secretly filmed them. So I didn't even notice that this picture was in the article, but I was responsible for getting the press to this event. And it was I have to say, it was a very successful event from a press perspective. One girlfriend who asked that I not use her name said Mr. Price would invite beautiful young women he met on Instagram to join them on his yacht, where she felt expected to entertain them. I'm tired of being the head of the harem, she wrote in her journal. 3 times he had sex with her in the middle of the night without her consent, she wrote in her journal. When they argued, she said Mr. Price would grab her hand and put a pulse monitor on her fingertip. What? His heart rate never was elevated, so he could make good decisions, he would say. Her pulse would race, so he said she was irrational. Oh my goodness gracious. This is me talking, you guys. I want to dispel the notion that when your heart races, you're irrational. That's not true, okay? I just want to make sure you know that. The day after she confided in a friend whom I spoke with, the friend was on a plane to help her grab things from Mr. Price's house and yacht and leave. There's no labor shortage. There's a shortage of jobs treating people with basic respect. Liked 122,000 times. That was a tweet from Dan Price. Mr. Forbes shared information about the Palm Springs incident with employees at Gravity. The news roiled the office. Quote, "This is supposed to be a company that holds itself to a higher standard," said Ludwig, who worked there for a year and a half, but it kind of reeked. Mr. Price took a leave of absence in the fall of 2021, but at a company meeting last November, Mr. Price, who was the company's sole owner and board member, said he was ready to return. Late this January, Mr. Price met Shelby Alexandra Hain, an artist with whom he first messaged in 2019 on Instagram. Quote, "I greatly admire your adventurous spirit," he wrote to her, "and you're super hot. Lols." They exchanged messages. Ms. Hain, then 24, shared that she had recently graduated from college. He shared a clip of himself on Fox Business saying, "Here's my morning so far." Mr. Price proposed times to meet, but Ms. Hain brushed him off. A few months later, he tried again. There is Ms. Hain. People she admired regularly posted items from Mr. Price, and when she ran across Mr. Forbes' blog, now again, this is the social media playing a big role in this. He was growing in such influence online with his message that people were sharing his message, and so he was influencing influencers. And all these people who were being influenced to believe that he lived the way he spoke. When she ran across Mr. Forbes' blog, she wondered, is this just some person with a vendetta? That's a fair question. She said she hoped that Mr. Price could provide advice and connections to integrate activism into her art. She and her boyfriend decided it was worth meeting him, even if he might expect a date. Quote, "You're doing the most impressive things," Ms. Hain wrote Mr. Price in December. In January, they had a dinner at a restaurant in Seattle's Capitol Hill where she said they discussed politics. What happened next was detailed in interviews, a police report, and text messages. Once again, we're getting into some dicey territory here from a triggering perspective, but also understand that all this information has been deeply reported on, and though he is not convicted of these things, we know that these are the things that are being reported in police reports and text messages, etc. As the restaurant closed, her Uber app wasn't working, and Mr. Price suggested they stay warm in his Tesla as she downloaded it again. Sitting in the front seats, he tried to kiss her and grabbed her throat, she told the police. Quote, "He did not let go of my throat right away," she recalled. "After I rejected him, he said he transformed." Ms. Hain called her boyfriend, pretending he was her brother, and asked him to rush and get her. Mr. Price sped north, driving her to a park and ride. She was scared because he was very drunk, the police report said. "Hurry," she texted her boyfriend. Mr. Price raced to the top floor of the parking lot, drove the car in donut circles, and pulled into a spot, she told the police. He reached over to kiss her and grabbed her throat again, his hand pulsing in and out for minutes, the police report said. "Squeezing hard," she would text a friend the next morning. And then he let go. "I'm too drunk," Ms. Hain recalled him saying, as he went to the back seat to pass out. As her boyfriend, Jesse Snowden, pulled up next to them, she jumped in and pointed her fingers forward and was like, "Go now," Mr. Snowden recalled. When she described what just happened, Mr. Snowden remembered Mr. Forbes' blog. Ms. Hain wrote him to share her story. Mr. Forbes connected her with Ms. Margus, Ms. Cologne, and several other women. Quote, I told her she should call the police and file a police report. Her father, Steve Hain, a criminal defense attorney, told me. Ms. Hain is not the only woman who described Ms. Price's hands on her neck. Danny Eschini, an activist for transgender rights, remembered her first date with Mr. Price a decade ago when they met on OkCupid. After a pleasant time at a bar, he walked her back to her apartment building, which they entered through a garage. When she would not invite him upstairs, he snapped, she said, and pushed her against a wall. He gripped my neck and kind of choked me, she said. He put his hands down the back of her skirt and assaulted her, she said, before she could shove him away. She said he tried to laugh it off. I just thought this was what girls liked, she recalled him saying. It's painful, she said, that he's the poster child for this politics I really care about. August 2022, 775,000 followers on Twitter. That's a lot, y'all. Mr. Price has gained hundreds of thousands of followers online since Ms. Margus fled Palm Springs last April. I'm going to stop right here and say this might be the most important part of the story, okay? You heard the background. You heard the difference between the person he presents himself to be online, the person that his former employees are talking about, and now the person that's being described by these women, their experiences with these women, who he connected with in most part on social media. On Monday, the Palm Springs Police Department submitted its investigation to the Riverside County District Attorney, recommending a charge of a drug victim, according to Lieutenant Gustavo Ariza. The prosecutors must now decide whether to file charges. Ms. Margus said she feared a backlash online if she accused him publicly. She had received threats after appearing in a BuzzFeed video about the Las Vegas shooting. And because she modeled swimsuits, she worried people might say that she had asked for what she had not asked for. I'm going to read this paragraph again, because it's so very important to understand that when someone comes out and makes an allegation and then is attacked, that whether or not the allegation is true or false, if they're attacked, especially if you don't know it's false, and they're attacked and victim blamed for it, it rolls into more people and more women not wanting to report what happened to them because they're going to be victim blamed. They're going to be blamed for whatever they did. It's as if men have no power over themselves when it comes to women. And that's not the case. And whoever is preying on somebody, whoever's acting in these ways, whether they're a man or a woman, they need to control themselves. They need to control their responses to stimuli, not the other way around. No one controls your response to stimuli, even if it's a very, very sexy girl in a bathing suit. You don't get to say that it's her fault that she's a sexy girl and you can control your behavior, okay? So this is why it's so important to listen to this paragraph again. Ms. Margus said she feared a backlash online if she accused him publicly. She had received threats after appearing in a BuzzFeed video about the Las Vegas shooting. She wasn't the shooter. Why was she being attacked? And because she modeled swimsuits, she worried people might say she had asked for what she had not asked for. All right, continuing on. But in February, something changed that made her think she could be believed. Prosecutors in Seattle charged Mr. Price in Ms. Hain's case. The city brought 3 charges against him: reckless driving, assault, and assault with sexual motivation. The Seattle Times reported on the case in April, and Mr. Price went from posting multiple times a day to going totally dark on social media. Later that month, Ms. Hain said the prosecutor told her that the city might drop the charges after seeing that some of the earlier Instagram messages she exchanged with Price were flirtatious. You can flirt with somebody. That doesn't mean you get to assault them, put your hands around their necks. It's just ridiculous. Her father, a lawyer, wrote a stern letter, and Mr. Forbes, the blogger, emailed several women urging them to share their storage and Instagram screenshots with the prosecutor. The prosecutor's office declined to comment. On May 31st, Mr. Price appeared stone-faced, his long hair looking slightly damp, on a court video conference. There was another time his hair looked slightly damp, when he was on Fox Business, and I had helped arrange the interview, and he arrived with wet hair. Mr. Price's lawyer entered not guilty pleas on his behalf. The prosecutor had dropped a charge for assault with sexual motivation, but proceeded with the case for reckless driving and assault. Mr. Price's lawyer entered not guilty pleas on his behalf, and the judge issued a non-harassment order until a trial scheduled for October. Quote, "I trust the legal process and I'm looking forward to presenting my defense and proving my innocence," Mr. Price said in his statement to the Times. Fair enough. He began tweeting again in mid-July. He got 500,000 likes in his first week back. Let's talk about it. We parted ways well before these recent allegations came up, but I was aware of his ex-wife's allegations. And after we parted ways, COVID hit and he took his message about, pay equality to social media and he shot into the stratosphere after already having a pretty strong following. People inside the company knew him as a much different person than the guy he projected on social media, and anyone with experience understanding, toxic patterns of behavior understood that he was likely worse to people in his personal life, but I don't think there was any way for them to know how much worse. And now we're starting to learn how much worse if these allegations are true. Now that people like this guy can use social media to mask their real life behavior and intentions, it's important to recognize the red flags before swallowing everything a person has to say as fact, especially about themselves. Watch them live how they are saying and doing actually the things that they're saying they do in real life before you believe anything they say online. Okay? With that said, you have no idea what's going on in people's personal lives. You have no idea whether maybe this guy may have affected one of your friends and they haven't talked about it yet, or a guy like this guy allegedly is messing with a friend of yours. Just come on, be nice, be supportive, be a good friend. Don't tear people down, and realize that people on social media could very well have been your friend in real life. You don't want to tear them down either, right? Thanks for watching, and peace out.